Good evening, everyone. I'm Nathan Bell, the city's finance director, and similar to last year, before we convene and kick off the FY26 budget process, I wanted to do a budget training. Partially just for folks, last time I saw you was roughly a year ago, so just to kind of reestablish role of the budget committee and reasons we do the things that we do, but also for folks who are joining us for the first time, potentially in the audience or online. I am not going to do the financial training this year. We have two new members on the budget committee, Councilor Stout and committee member Bob Brew, both from Ward 6. I had the opportunity to meet with both of them prior to this evening and talk about the city finances. Tonight's training is going to talk about the process over the coming 3 evenings, Oregon budget law, and then the role of the budget committee. And want this to be a conversation. If you have any questions, just raise your hand. Also, because we haven't kicked off the formal meeting, elected a chair, I'm calling folks for this portion. So the first bullet's not relevant anymore because we have full control over people speaking who are joining us online. So, but if you are joining us online with a tablet, smartphone, or computer and wish to speak during the business from the audience, please use the raise the hand option to be called upon to provide comment when the designated time is announced. That's going to be at the bottom of your screen, the little hand. Public comment that is submitted by email. Email will be read into the record if time permits. We've set aside 20 minutes each evening for business from the audience. And then just want to mention that this is being recorded and the entire room is mic'd. So in our council chambers where each individual speaker has a microphone, in here, they're up in the ceiling and they're very sensitive and they will pick up side conversations, including people in the audience. So just be mindful of that as the evening progresses. Voting mechanics. So for motions, voice vote, all in favor, aye, all opposed, no. Deciding on motions. In the case of any no votes, the chair will need to ask for a roll call vote in order to identify the vote count and vote ownership for the record. For the election of officers, if it's just a single nominee, it's going to be the process I just described. If it's more than one nominee, we're going to do a roll call vote, ask that each voting member indicate the name of the nominee they wish to cast a vote in favor of. And then department directors will be joining us all 3 evenings. We've set aside 30 minutes at the end of this presentation for questions to the departments. Similar to the past, again, if you have a question for a department, bring up that department director. And then we ask that anyone else who has questions for that department, ask them at that time. And that'll help us move through all the departments more efficiently. And also recognizing that you may not have questions for every department. All right, the agenda. So the budget committee training, and then following this will be a brief intermission. And then we'll convene the FY26 budget process with the welcome from the returning chair, Luke Knows. She'll ask for a roll call vote from staff, and then we'll immediately go into election of officers. Once a chair has been elected, we'll immediately pass the gavel, and that individual will facilitate the meeting from that point forward. Then we'll have a budget message from City Manager Nancy Newton, a budget review from myself, followed by another intermission. And then when we return, we have 30 minutes set aside for questions and discussion on the budget, and then 20 minutes for business from the audience. And that will conclude the first evening. Tuesday, May 13th. Again, we'll kick off with a welcome and roll call from the chair. And then similar to last year, and something we're doing new is for the second and third evening, we'll do business from the audience at the beginning of the meeting. This allows an opportunity for people to be able to speak without having to sit through the entire meeting. And then we've set aside 2 hours for questions and discussion on the budget. And again, all the department heads will be available. And that'll conclude the second evening. And then Wednesday, May 14th, the final evening, we'll start off with the budget process for the Springfield Economic Development Agency. That's essentially just a scaled down version of the city's process, followed by a brief intermission, and then reconvening the city's final evening for the 2026 budget process. and then business from the audience. And then we'll have a state share revenue presentation and public hearing. And then we've allotted for another 30 minutes, questions and discussion on the budget, brief intermission. And then when we come back, it's city budget deliberations and approval. And what I essentially do is bring up a spreadsheet for any adjustments, and it'll be pre-populated this year. We have a couple items that came to our attention after we put the budget together. And being prior to adoption, they need to be included. We'll ask for a motion, a second, and then folks who approve the items that we've added. And then after that, we'll entertain motions for any adjustments from the budget committee. For a adjustment to make it on there, it's going to need a motion, a second, and then it's going to need a quorum vote. And I'll speak about a quorum here in a little bit. And then to conclude our FY26 budget process, there'll be a series of motions that are at the back of your packet. Oregon budget law, essentially, it does three important things. It establishes standard procedures for preparing, presenting, and administering the budget. It requires citizen involvement in the preparation of the budget and public disclosure of the budget before its formal adoption. And it controls expenditure of public funds. And I'm going to touch on each of these in the following slides. The budget process starts with the proposed budget being prepared, and usually we kick off that process in October, where we'll bring a 5-year forecast in front of the council and discuss some of the issues that are going to be impacting the coming budget cycle. And then the budget team starts to meet weekly. The budget team is made up of myself, Nancy Newton, city manager, Neil Adati, assistant city manager, Jessica Mummy, the budget and procurement manager, Mary Bridget Smith, city attorney, and Shane Hertz, our HR director. We open our budgeting software in early December. That closes in late January. And then we meet with all the individual departments in the spring to go over their budgets, culminating in a balanced and proposed budget that comes in front of you. The entire process takes about 6 months and involves a lot of staff and time. The budget committee meets. We're doing now over 3 evenings. The budget committee approves and recommends the budget. Budget summary and notice of budget hearing is published. The budget hearing is held. That's going to be on June 16th in a regular council session if anyone wants to join us. The budget's adopted, appropriations are made, and a tax levy declared. And then our last step is we file with the county and the levy is certified. The second item of those three important things is citizen involvement. Local budget law requires that a budget committee be formed and a public process conducted to approve the budget. The budget committee is the city's fiscal planning advisory committee. The committee consists of the city councilors and an equal number of citizens at large. Citizen members are appointed by city council. They serve 3-year terms. Terms are staggered to turn over by a third each year, and you can serve 2 consecutive terms before being required to sit out a year. The budget committee's main role meets publicly to deliberate on the proposed budget, provides an opportunity for the general public to comment on the proposed budget, may make adjustments to the proposed budget, approves and recommends a balanced budget to the city council for adoption. And I want to stress that it's a recommending body. It is not a decision-making body. Recommends tax levies and debt service amounts, holds public hearing and makes recommendations to the city council on the use of state shared revenue monies, and communicates with members of the community about the budget process, opportunity to provide input, and the constraints the city faces in financing all requested services. And this gets to the core of your role. We see you as ambassadors to the city's budget. You have this opportunity to look under the hood, to see all the city's services and the cost of providing those, and then to take that information out to the larger community and share the knowledge you have. What the budget committee is not authorized to do. You cannot change salaries. You cannot negotiate contracts. You cannot change council priorities or policies, and you cannot change the law.
Is that right? Oh, man.
Yes. Made a comment last year, Councilor Doyle. According to what I listened to it. What are the rules regarding the budget committee meetings? Open to the public. A quorum is required to approve any motion. One more than half the total number of members, and that's based on total number of members, not members present. So for our purposes, a quorum is going to be 7 individuals. If no quorum exists, may discuss committee business, but no formal action will be taken. It requires the election of a chair and a vice chair, and we've added a secretary to that as well. Positions serve 1 year. Chair is expected to maintain an aura of impartiality, to run the meeting in a fair, equitable, and civil manner, ensuring members of the public are provided an open forum to speak about the budget. Minutes or recording of each meeting must be kept. The approval of the final budget document, tax levies, and debt service amount should be in the form of a motion with the votes recorded in the minutes. Again, those are at the back of the packet. And then discussions of the budget committee must always take place in the forum of a public meeting. And so I discourage you from reaching out to one another outside these meetings to discuss the proposed budget, but that doesn't preclude you from talking about the budget with the general public. A couple of other items I wanted to touch on. Oregon budget law requires a budget committee, requires the budget be developed and balanced by fund, requires legal appropriations at some level. So our legal level is by fund, by department, by category. One of our categories is operating, which is the 500,000 accounts personnel, 600,000 accounts materials and services, 700,000 accounts capital outlay, all combined into operating. 800,000 capital projects are their own legal level, and then 900,000 are non-departmental and is broken into multiple fiscal categories. Let's see, it encourages public involvement by public meetings, and it serves to control spending by limiting changes the city council can make. And so when this budget's adopted and we have dollars that are locked up in those reserves are meant for future years. And there's very specific guidance that kind of dictates how we can access that. And essentially for us to access those reserves during the budget year, it has to be something that we did not know at the time that the budget came together. If you want any additional information on Oregon budget law, you can find it at the Department of Revenue website, and I have that website up there. And then finally, I talked about all the requirements, and it begs the question, who follows up on this? And actually, it's our auditors as part of our annual comprehensive audit. So in the back of our app, there is a document. It's actually the very last page. It's in the compliance section, and it's the independent auditor's report required by Oregon state regulations. And then in there, there's a paragraph that talks about compliance as part of obtaining reasonable assurance about whether the city's financial statements are free of material misstatement. They perform tests of its compliance with certain provisions of laws, regulations, contracts, etc. And then there's a list of bolded items. And the third item is budgets legally required. And then the paragraph that matters is the following one. In connection with our testing, nothing came to our attention that caused us to believe the city was not in substantial compliance. So essentially, it's a clean bill that we are following all the rules around preparing a budget in the state of Oregon. For this budget cycle, fiscal year 26, that will be in the fiscal year 25 annual comprehensive financial report. We'll be closing that fiscal year here in June, and then that report is usually on our website by January. So that's a way that you can circle back on the process. If any of you cannot make it to any of the evenings for any reason, please let myself or Jessica Mummy know, and our contact information is up there. And questions? All right, we're through that training, so let's do a brief intermission unless people want to move right into the budget process.
I don't need a break. Do anybody else need a break?
So are you ready to kick things off?
I'm ready, but let me, never mind.
I call the meeting of the Springfield Budget Committee to order. Could we have a roll call, please?
Counselor Weber.
Here.
Counselor Mo.
Here.
Counselor Rodley. Counselor Blackwell.
Here.
Counselor Doyle.
Here.
Counselor Stout.
Here.
Jason Miller.
Here.
Devin Marche Duncan.
Here.
Michael Roman.
Here.
Ruth Linos.
Here.
Art Ayer.
Here.
Bob Brew.
Here.
Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. As we begin our meeting tonight, I would like to ask members of the audience who are joining online to please keep yourselves on mute until you're called to provide public testimony. There is one time this evening designated for public testimony and would be listed as business from the audience on the agenda. If you're attending in person, please complete the request to speak card located at the entrance of the library meeting room and give them to the budget and procurement manager. If you're joining us online with a tablet, smartphone, or computer and wish to speak during that time, please use the raise hand option to be called upon to provide comment when the designated time is announced. The order of public testimony is as follows. Anyone who is in person at City Hall. Second, anyone who has raised their virtual hand. Third, anyone who has submitted email in advance. And fourth, anyone who has submitted written comment via mail in advance. So next on the agenda is the election of a chairperson, vice chairperson, and secretary. I'd like to open up the floor for nominations for the position of chair.
Do either one of you, are either of you interested in doing it?
I think Ruth's doing a great job.
Are you interested? Okay, well then I'd like to nominate Devin.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other nominations?
Need a second? Do you need a second?
I need a second.
A second.
Okay. Bob provided a second. Let's see.
Just all those.
I think that closes with a single nomination. All in favor, say aye.
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 All
The
opposed.
close, same sign, nay. Motion carried. You are the new chair. Please.
You need to take over now.
I will bring it
You're up.
to you. Because the script is very helpful.
So where did you leave off?
Oh, second page.
Okay. So it looks like we're going into the staff opening remarks.
Essentially the same thing, but for a vice chair and a secretary.
Michael, are you
So
interested?
next on the agenda is the election for vice chairperson.
I'd like to nominate Michael.
Second.
To then call for the.
Call for a motion.
Yep.
All those in favor?
All those in favor?
Any opposed?
Any opposed?
That's consensus.
Yay. So then you wanted to call for secretary as well.
Secretary? There's none, she's the title.
Sure.
Okay. So I'd like to nominate Arthur as treasurer, as secretary.
I second that.
Any opposed? All in favor?
Aye.
So now, we're gonna move on to staff opening remarks. So Chair, next on the agenda, City Manager Nancy Newton is here to provide staff opening remarks and delivery of the budget message.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. I know it's a huge commitment, and I really appreciate you being here. You may recall last year, I kicked off my budget message with, I went on ChatGPT because I love it so much, and I asked it to produce a budget message in the theme of Taylor Swift, and it killed it. So I was like, how do I top it this year? So being that it's baseball season, and I love baseball, I thought I will see if ChatGPT can come up with a prompt, a quote. So my prompt was from the perspective of Yogi Berra, who was a Yankee, but I'll let that go. From the perspective of Yogi Berra, give me a quote about budgeting when you don't have any money. So that was my prompt. And it came up with this, which I thought was pretty good. The quote was, when the money runs out, you still got to spend it wisely. Not bad, ChatGPT, not bad at all. So this year is a little different than last year. You know, we're really in a time of reductions in the budget and, you know, as a result, you don't get as much bandwidth to really tweak things as a budget committee. I mean, obviously, you can make recommendations and do what you will, but as we go through this and I'm sure you've viewed the departmental presentations, we really are in a very restrictive time right now. So this is kind of one of those hold on years. But I want to talk a little bit about how we balance the budget this year. And so this proposed budget contains $3.11 million in reductions, 1.36 million from departmental reductions, and then $1.75 million from reserves. Nathan's going to get into all of that in a lot of detail later. I guess the message from me is it unfortunately doesn't solve our problem. We've talked for a number of years about the general fund structural deficit in the city. And, you know, this doesn't solve it. It buys us some time to do some other things. So in addition to this, we've had a parallel process that has been moving forward. I don't know how many of you have been tracking this issue, but the mayor convened a fiscal sustainability task force to look at exactly the issue of our general fund structural imbalance that you all are intimately familiar with in your work here. So the way that they really hit it hard in the beginning of the year. So they had 9 meetings every Wednesday night. They were meeting between January and March, and really looking at the structural imbalance from 4 different lenses. The first lens was reducing expenditures. The other lens was diversifying revenue sources. Third lens was, are there any economic development options that could be pursued? And the fourth lens was, are there any legislative changes or initiatives the city might want to undertake, maybe in a coalition with others, to see if we can address this, as it truly is a statewide issue. I think there's been a lot of interest in the media and also with other cities that are in various configurations of what we're going through tonight. So just to give you, that process is going on right now. So it's kind of odd because we have these 2 very important projects running on this parallel track. You happen to be meeting tonight to review the budget, and then the task force will provide their first presentation to the mayor and council in a week. So that will be the first time that the mayor and council will be hearing their recommendations and then mulling over, you know, what they think about that. Do they want to accept those? Do they want to modify those? Do they, you know, there's a host of things that they can do very similar to how they work with your process. You know, they can change it, adapt it, do whatever. So I say this to say that we're doing kind of a narrow scope, but and hopefully that scope will widen next year as we talk about different paths that the city may want to embark to address our structural imbalance. So there will be another opportunity for the council to discuss the mayor's fiscal sustainability task force on June 30th. So hopefully, this is my hope, we will have some good feedback from the elected officials prior to them taking a well-deserved summer recess. And then over summer recess, we're going to be talking about how, you know, implementation and how we make that happen on the ground level. But all of that being said, it probably sounds like I'm making your box really small, and I'm really not trying to do that. I'm just talking about the reality of this year's budget. But you still have a super important role to play here tonight. Local government is required to present a balanced budget. I love saying that because that is not the case on the federal level. So I'm very proud. I'm very, very proud that we put together a balanced budget. So that's my own little soapbox. So be proud of that. You know, that's a bragging right for us in our community. So we work on that. Nathan touched on our process that we do internally and with all of our departments involved. But so we put together this balanced budget, we bring it to you, and you are like our second set of eyes on that. You know, sometimes when you're working on a project, you know this, you've looked at it too many times, you're too close to it, you need somebody else to look at it and go, does this make sense? Does this check out? You know, what does this mean? You know, so these are the kinds of things that we rely on you. You each bring to this table a unique perspective, a unique background, set of skills. And this is a very talented group. So that's what we're relying on you to bring to this table, to really be our check in the process. So it's by no means a rubber stamp. It is you looking at our work and saying, does this make sense? And asking any questions, because if you have a question, chances are somebody else in the public will too, because you know it probably better than almost anybody. Nathan talked a little bit about the importance of the public process, and I think that's really critical. Oregon, it has very high standards for how we conduct our work as local government, and I'm very proud of that. Yes, it adds time, and yes, it requires that you all help us and step forward, but I think it produces a product that has a very high standard and really meets the intent of the community being involved in the stewardship of its resources. So that, I think, is another thing that you can be proud of. So I literally put in my notes right here, but Nancy, if our role is compressed, what should we do? And so I'm to borrow from the mayor, he often says, you know, be curious, but also feel empowered as your role in the public process. I would also encourage you to get to know your fellow budget committee members. The one thing I think that we sometimes could maybe, I always think of ways to tweak this process and improve it every year, and maybe doing a little bit more introductions and talking about your backgrounds, investing a little time in that, I think would be nice, because it's so interesting to me when I read your applications when you come before the board, and just what your life experience has been and how that will add to our process. And I think you all have something in common, and that you're all very invested in our community and you really care deeply about it. So, you know, this is a kind of a cool group of people to get to know. You're going to be working together for the next 3 nights and, you know, over the next few years. Ask a lot of questions. If something isn't clear, please speak up. You know, it's our job to make sure that we are presenting information in a clear way, in a concise way, so that anybody that looks at our documents could understand them. And then hopefully when we're done kind of tearing things apart, putting things together, digesting it all, you will feel comfortable to make a recommendation then that would move forward to the mayor and the council, who would then look at that recommendation and then take the action that they need to do. So that's how the sausage gets made. I don't eat sausage, so, you know, but I can describe it. I just again want to reiterate how important it is that you're here tonight and how much I really appreciate it. It's not a nice night outside, which is a nice bonus, but it doesn't go unnoticed by us that you are bringing substantial experience, talent, and dedication to this process. So I just wanted to thank you for that, and I will hand it back over to Nathan.
Right, thank you. Our budget overview. These are gonna be familiar slides. They're good slides in terms of providing, I think, a great context for the environment that this budget came together in. And the conversations that we're gonna be having over these 3 evenings. And again, I want this to be a conversation, so feel free to reach out or speak out with any questions. And then just for ease of facilitation, I'll call on folks if they have questions during my presentation. I covered this in pretty good detail in the budget training, so I won't spend any time on that. All right, measure 5 and 50. You can't have a conversation on budget in the state of Oregon without talking about measure 5 and 50. And interesting is we're now going on 30 years, but I think it's actually more relevant today than it ever has been. These were voter-led initiatives. Measure 5 in the early 90s essentially limits property taxes to $10 per thousand for general government, $5 per thousand for education. And that's based on real market value. Then in the late nineties, Measure 47, which became Measure 50, it did a number of things, but the primary thing it did as it relates to the conversation that we're having this evening is it put a collar on the growth of property taxes of 3%. And that created AV or assessed value and essentially broke away AV from real market value. At the time that these initiatives were passed, there were a lot of critics out there that said this was going to devastate funding of local government in the state of Oregon. And that it was going to go off of a cliff, and it didn't turn out that way, which is unfortunate because I think if it had, I think people might have rethought it a little sooner. But what I've always described Measure 5 and 50 as being is death by 1,000 cuts. And over the following decades, it provided this because of the historical low inflation that we enjoyed, a long runway to make adjustments, to find efficiencies, to increase fees for services and whatnot. However, the pandemic issued in this period of high inflation, and that inflation hit us a little later at the time that it was ongoing as all of our contracts were settled. The first contract to be renegotiated post-inflation was our SPA, Springfield Police Association contract. And that was negotiated in fiscal year 23, beginning in fiscal year 24. And that was around a 17% increase over 3 years. And then all the remaining contracts in the following fiscal year. So that inflation is really working its way through our budget right now. And you can see that in our 5-year forecast. The light shaded gray FY26 proposed, that's the budget that we have in front of you. It has a small deficit spend in there. And I think the main thing that I want to touch on, or there's a number of things, but if you look at the bottom of that column, you can see that any cash as a percent of operating expenditures, 26%. That is still a healthy fund balance. And historically, we used to aim for 20%. However, we just went with the most recent street bond through the rating process. And with our rating, one of the things that they had mentioned was that kind of led to us maintaining our good rating was that we had a really healthy fund balance. And they really liked the fact that it was 25%. And in fact, in the report that we got after that rating was made public, basically it's kind of describes the things that could potentially lead to a downgrading in that rating. And one of them was if we were to go below that 25%. So what was historically a 20% floor now is a 25% floor. And you can see then going into fiscal year 27 that we are dipping well below that at 19%. The other thing was when this forecast was up there last year's budget cycle, we had a $3 million deficit in fiscal year 26. And when we got up to that point, sure enough, it was still there. And it kind of lends itself to sort of our budget style here. And with budgeting, there is a tendency to overestimate your expenditures and underestimate your revenues because everybody wants to come under budget. No one wants to go over budget. However, when you're talking about potential, when you have budgets as tight as ours and you're looking at potentially cutting services or potentially laying folks off, you don't want to be making those kind of decisions on an overly conservative budget. And so we really tried to just dial in our numbers, and we have approached this that we're fine going over budget as well as going under budget. And we want to forecast what we most accurately think is going to happen. And just to give you a kind of an idea of that, in fiscal year 24, so we have what we refer to as every year fiscal savings as the dollars that we are come under in totality our legal level appropriation. And in the general fund, we have roughly 10 legal levels because it's by fund, by department. So cumulatively, we've kind of averaged fiscal savings in the range of $800,000 to $1 million a year. And when we finished fiscal year 24, we had fiscal savings of 1.2 million. However, we had done a supplemental budget in the general fund of 1.3 million to add overtime to the budgets of both fire and police. And the end result was we actually went over budget by $100,000 in that year, the adopted budget. There was no fiscal savings. That's how tight we are budgeting right now. I'm expecting something similar in fiscal year 25 and kind of going forward. With that in mind, we still build fiscal savings into our forecast. We have $800,000 of fiscal savings built into each of the years in FY 27 and after. And then the other thing I think I want to mention is, and I have a later slide, we'll go into this a little bit, but the ARPA funds that we received from the federal government, we received $14 million. And we use those for some great one-time projects. And one example is our legacy streetlight project, where we replaced all our streetlights with high-efficiency LED. And that's a project we expect to break even. We spent roughly $3 million. We think in energy savings that will break even after 11 years, and then it's just savings thereafter. But we also use some of those ARPA funds to shore up our general. And I'll save that for a little bit later in terms of how we use those, but they are had to be expended by December 31st, 2024. So those were expended in fiscal year 25. And as a result, we had $2 million in personnel staffing that came back into the general fund. And that's what has contributed to that deficit spend that we had in 26 and beyond. Before I go to the next slide, just a couple other things. PERS, our PERS rates, we get our PERS rates every other year on even years. So 26 was the most recent PERS rate. We actually underestimated on that. So again, just our willingness to try to really kind of dial things in. And then we'll see our next one in fiscal year 28. So you see that jump from the deficit spend from 27 to 28. And then as far as inflation goes, it's 25, 26, 27. Those are negotiated contracts. Those are real numbers. We're not using estimates. We're back into estimates in the fiscal year 28 and thereafter. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the economy. I think there was some positive news today as it relates to tariffs. But again, it's one of the things that we're paying attention to. Inflation has a way of kind of being self-perpetuating and sticky. So we don't want to be too cautious, but at the same time, we don't want to be left flat-footed. But so those are estimates, but there are also real numbers that we're looking at to problem solve in those outer years. So with that forecast in mind, I think, you look at this and you say, okay, well, how are we going to solve that deficit spend? And one of the ways you can do it is you can cut. And the place where we end up cutting is it's our largest expense is personnel. However, this slide shows our FTE per thousand population. And you can see in the dark blue, the peaks and the valleys are essentially kind of tracking recessions and cutting of staff. So you can see where we've cut and we've added and we've cut and we've added and we've cut and we've added. But I think kind of the bigger message here is that over that same period of time, the population of this city has grown, and that is what it drives service levels. And so if we look at our FTE as a percent of residents, we went from a high back in 97 of 4.94 per thousand to a low of 3.41 where we're at today. And that we feel that every day. I mean, we are a lean organization. And, as part of that fiscal stability task force, we hired Eagle Northwest to help with some analysis. And one of the things they did was benchmarking. And compared to a lot of our peers in terms of FTE, we're at the lowest end. So the general fund is, I think, where you'll hear a lot of my focus. It's our largest fund, and it's where we have a lot of our core services. In the general fund, we have our police services, our fire services, our library, our planning, and our code enforcement. Looking at that chart there, and it's our actuals into our amended and proposed, it looks healthy. I mean, you see this kind of nice kind of trending green line, which is our revenues. They're greater than our expenditures, which are kind of just tracking there just right below. And the shaded gray is our reserve. So you can see kind of that consistent reserve balance across that. And it looks this way because there's a lot of work that goes into balancing our budget, and which we've done, each successive year. But looking at that forecast, it is getting to a point now where we don't have the capacity to do it through the kind of traditional means of mainly reductions. And we need to find some alternative way to balance that. Again, looking at the general fund, this is looking at, looking at it as a pie chart and the services and the costs associated with them. The largest one is public safety. We've lumped that together. That includes police, fire, and our municipal court. And of that total general fund budget, it is 34.3 million, but that's not the total cost because we also have our administrative services. That includes our finance, HR, IT, legal, and our city manager's office. Typically, those costs are part of the service. However, they're separated in our general fund. What we do is we allocate them out to the different departments. But because public safety and administrative services are both in the general fund, we can't allocate without creating this sort of redundant revenue and expenditure. So while all the other departments that have their own funds like sewer and street and ambulance and drainage do a transfer of money to cover their proportionate share of admin services, public safety does not. Public safety makes up 40% of our personnel FTE. That's how we allocate our administrative services. So if we were to take another 40% of that 6.8 million of administrative services, we're looking at an additional 2.8 million for a total cost of public safety that is 37.1 million. So keep that number in mind. Now we're looking at the pie on the revenue side of the general fund. And looking at our largest revenue on there, it's our property taxes that come in at $28 million. So $37.1 million to full cost in public safety. Yeah, property taxes are only $28 million, far short of covering the cost of public safety. And I think that's kind of one of the larger misconceptions in the general public. And where we really experience this is at our development counter when folks have to pay additional fees for different services. And it's like, isn't this what my property taxes are for? Property taxes don't even cover the full cost of public safety, let alone any other service that we have at the city.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes,
How many people are paying the taxes on their real estate taxes to the city? Like if you had a number, 62,000 people in the city of Springfield, like how many houses and what have you, or properties?
I mean, well, that's a good question. I mean, there's I think around 22,000 households. But then we get into, apartment buildings and whatnot, and then a lot of property taxes. And I think this is the other thing that folks don't understand. In the back of our act for our annual comprehensive financial report, we have our top 10 taxpayers, and our number one taxpayer is International Paper. And I think their tax bill comes in around $2 million of that 28 million. Our industry is really where we get some large property tax payments. Without going too far into the weeds, there's kind of a growing sort of movement and recognition that single family homes, large lots don't cover, their taxes do not cover the full cost of services. They tend to be, one of these losers, though I did just use it. They don't cover those services. And so what we're finding really is this industry, and I actually got into this conversation with Councilor Stout when we met. But there's an outfit out there, Urban 3, that has this cost of service analysis, and they graph the increment generated by parcel and the cost of services to that parcel. And what you see is in dense urban environments, you see a spike of generate more increment than they consume in services. And then when you get out to the suburbs, you see spikes downward where they consume more services than they generate an increment.
I guess I'm trying to figure out, like, if you went out for a bond and you read that it says it's $1.64 per thousand on your house or whatever, how do they come up with that number? If we know we need $10 million and then we ask for a certain amount, somehow we're able to calculate that it's only $1.50 or it's 54 cents or whatever. I guess that's what I'm trying to get at.
So-
I mean, if it's too complicated for no, I get.
So what you have is you have your total assessed value. It's not broken down.
Okay,
But, our total assessed value, and off the top of my head, I mean, just throwing a big number just because it's big. Let's say it's $6 billion. Then, we can take a rate and apply it against our assessed value and figure out what we need to charge. And we're actually gonna be doing that here, in a couple weeks because we're having a renewal of our fire levy.
Okay.
And so, that's part of what is we make a calculation. Okay, we want to raise X number of dollars. What's the rate we need to charge that will produce it with our assessed value in this community? And I was just gonna say is in terms of how we, cover the cost of public safety, we use a number of other revenues. And sometimes we're using revenues that might be better aligned with other activities. I'm gonna just give you one example. In the license permits and fees, that includes franchise fees. We have a franchise arrangement with Santa Pac, our local waste hauler. That brings in around $800,000 a year. You can think of the justification, for that is talking about their heavy trucks on the roads and the wear and tear that creates. Yet all that money is coming into the general fund. It's not going into the street fund. A lot of other franchises are based on being on a right of way and the impact that it has, again, to our infrastructure. It goes into the general fund. So we've found other kind of revenue streams that kind of combine with our property taxes to help us fund those public safety. But over time, again, we're getting to that point where we sort of grabbed all the revenues that we can kind of make a connection to in the general fund, and we've sort of come to the end of the road as far as they go. All right, I'll try to move quickly through these, but I'd like to show just that same chart I showed you for the general fund for some of our other, what I refer to as our bellwether funds. They're funds that are critical to the fiscal health of the organization. And the street fund is definitely one of those. It's another one of our more challenging funds. Back in the Great Recession in 08, and I think that really, recessions tend to hit government later and they tend to leave government later. And that kind of, I think, sort of its impact all the way up through 2014. But we cut our operation staffing to the bare minimum. And in doing so, we essentially stopped all of our preservation activities, which is problematic because it's better to maintain and maximize the useful life of an asset than to and delay the replacement than to replace it. And so there was a House Bill 2017 that generated some additional gas tax and vehicle registration money from the state of Oregon that came down. That started to come down, I think, in 20 or 21. And we were able to add staffing back to bring back our crack sealing and slurry seal program. And, they're very cost-effective forms of maintenance in terms of extending the useful life of our street infrastructure. However, what's been challenging with the street fund is its primary revenue source is a gas tax. The gas tax is in the form of cents, not in the form of a percentage. So it doesn't grow with inflation. In fact, we're experiencing the opposite with the proliferation of electrical vehicles and higher fuel efficient vehicles. We're seeing our revenue essentially flatline, but our expenditures are continuing to grow. So we got that bump from HB 2017, but now we're essentially growing past it again. You see that revenue spike in the green in FY24. That was a one-time ODOT reimbursement for some expenditures that we had incurred over previous years. And then also you see the expenditure jump in 24. That was the ice storm and our response to the ice storm. A lot of those monies have been submitted to FEMA for reimbursement, reimbursed up to 75%. However, a lot of those reimbursements are kind of now in question. So there's some uncertainty around whether those are still going to be going forward. And so 24, I think we had a little bit of ice storm in 25. And then really what's kind of happening caused that trajectory of the expenditure to kind of continue up. As I mentioned, the ASPE contract would have been renegotiated beginning in FY25. And so inflation is coming in to this fund. So we're headed back to a place where we may be put in a position where we have to, again, discontinue our preservation activities.
Nathan,
Yes.
are they in question if we'll get them at all, or if what the percentage will be, those reimbursements? What's in question?
Well, I think, some of the guidance that we see come down from the federal government that, I know a lot of those grants have just been frozen in the short term, but there's a lot of conversations happening about what should be qualifying for a federal emergency response. And I think going forward, they're removing, winter storms as a qualification. I don't know where an ice storm fits into that. I don't know if that's gonna go backwards in time or if it's gonna just be a moment forward. There's just so much uncertainty around it, but it can take years for, in a perfect world, when everything is sort of normal, they can still take years for those reimbursements to come through. But I think there's an added layer of sort of uncertainty around them right now. And these were critical funds, for this fund in terms of kind of maintaining these programs. And that's how kind of an event like that, what it can do to kind of the fiscal stability of the fund.
Nathan, is that, if you'll go back to the slide, so we're basically spending down to no reserve.
What the shaded gray is that we've started to spend down those reserves. And again, every fund has its own, I think, kind of calculation of what would be an appropriate reserve balance. So it would be different, but the same thing is we want to have some sort of reserve balance in the street fund. Transit lodging tax fund, this is one of our stronger funds, actually, and this is taxed from overnight stays in hotels, motels, and Airbnbs. Why this is a critical fund is that our ordinance for a transit lodge tax predates 2003. After 2003, only 30% of your money can go towards non-tourism related activities. But we're legacied in, and we actually transfer 5/9 of our revenue to the general fund in support of public safety, with the idea that for folks to want to come to a community to visit, you're going to need a safe community. So that 5/9 makes up a significant amount of money, and that again, when I talked about kind of what helps prop up our public safety in the general fund, it's this TLT transfer. Let's see, you see that dip in 20 and 21. That was the pandemic, and then the surge in 22. I think we would attribute that to pent up, yes. And then we've sort of normalized again. And then the spike in expenditures was the Olympic trials, and we purchased the property Under the Flame. And then in 26, we're doing some capital work around our depot. It's one of the city assets. It's the old train depot where the Chamber of Commerce is. So that's what that spike would be. Building code fund, I describe this as our feast or famine fund because development is cyclical, but we have been feasting for a while. Our reserves are over $7 million. After the Great Recession, we took our reserves down to almost zero. And the challenge in this fund is a lot of times at least for us, our staffing level is our bench for all the different types of inspections we do is one. So when we looked, it's not like you could just cut an FT at that point. And so we had to negotiate with the union to reduce all staffing down to 0.75. Development turned around before we had to kind of move on enacting that. And then it's just, development has been strong thereafter. However, these monies can only be used for the building code program. They cannot be used for any other purpose. So it's money that we cannot access. Sanitary sewer, and I'll just talk about the drainage fund. These are two really healthy funds. They're primarily supported by user fees, and we're able to set those user fees based on full cost recovery. That's for both our operations and our capital programs. Our ambulance fund. This is another one of our challenging funds. And then has an impact to the general fund, and that we've had some deficit spends in past years where the general fund makes up the balance of that. And the challenge we're having, this was when I first started here, I've been here now almost 20 years. When I first started here, this was a really healthy fund. However, federal government has reduced the reimbursements for Medicare and Medicaid for transports. A typical transport costs us around $2,200. Medicare and Medicaid reimburse us roughly around $400 for that transport. And just to give you kind of an idea of the scope of that, Medicare, Medicaid transports make up roughly 82% of our transports. So, how do we address this? One of them is the GEMT monies. These are ground emergency medical transport monies. It's federal money passed from the state down to us. That's gonna help with, kind of covering that delta between what it costs us and what they reimburse us. But also in terms of how we approach our ambulance services. We've got a really creative chief, and one of the things that he's implemented is single role. Historically, we've used dual role or fire paramedics in all of our staffing positions for fire and life safety. In our ambulance fund now, we're using a single role, so we've got ambulances that are staffed with just paramedics and EMTs, and that is a cheaper resource than a fire paramedic. We'll continue, we've contracted out our ambulance billing. There's just over the years, the fire med program, which is an insurance program. There's a number of steps that we've taken to address the challenges that we have here. But it continues to be a challenging fund and something we'll be working on in the future. I've touched on this with sewer. Booth Kelly, this is our commercial property fund years ago. Weyerhaeuser donated the Booth Kelly site to us, and that actually, in leasing that out, has been a really, I would refer to it as just kind of a cash generator, and we've been able to use that fund to subsidize our general fund to the tune of $200,000 to $300,000 a year for decades. However, in fiscal year 19, we lost an anchor tenant. You see that drop. That was Greenbrier Rail. Anyone's been out to the site, we have our Sawtooth building that has a rail spur. It's a very unique facility that we just happened to have a tenant that it was perfectly suited towards. And when they consolidated operations, Springfield was one of the places that they discontinued their operations. And that was a really big blow to our Booth Kelly fund. Additionally, with that subsidy, that transfer of $200,000 to $300,000 over the years, that also came at the expense of deferred maintenance at this site. So deferred maintenance, we've got a large backlog of deferred maintenance at this site. And this medical dental reserve, this isn't a fund, it's within the insurance fund, but I show this one because it's really a bright spot. It's going to come into a conversation later this evening. We have a self-insured health program. I think we're going on 14 or 15 years. And over that period of time, we've been able to hold our premiums flat. And that is essentially unheard of in both from our peers in both self-insured and traditional insured programs. So it's been one of the bright spots in our budget. And that, I think, has just been a very healthy workforce in terms of a great experience. But also, we have a wellness clinic on site, which is very popular, and we have a number of health initiatives that our HR department does. Some years back, we hired an actuary to look at what reserve balance we should have for this program. At the time, and I think it was about a decade ago, it was around 3 million. We've kind of increased that to 4 million. That's that blue line. So with the reserves above that, what we've been doing is rather than lower the premiums, because we have both an employer and employee premium. The employer makes up the bulk of it, I think around 95%. The employee pays around 5%. But when you lower a premium and then you turn on and increase it later, you don't get credit for when you lowered it. And so we've been trying to just keep it flat and try to grow into it. And part of that then is we've been doing these benefit holidays, where once or twice a year, we don't charge the premium on a payroll for a month to the employee. And then we take the employer portion and we still transfer it over to the fund, but we put it into a separate bucket and not into the self-insured program. And over time, then we have built up what we refer to as just a rainy day reserve. We use that rainy day reserve to buy into the state some years back. Did per site accounts where if you made a contribution, they would match it by 25%. So we sent over 2 million. And then it built back up. And then we've used some of those dollars to balance our budget this year. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. But it was worth noting for that reason. So our fiscal year 26 budget and the number that yes, Bob.
Nathan, so some of that money is coming from, say, like the street fund.
Yes.
Are there restrictions?
I'm gonna talk about that.
Okay.
Yes, there are restrictions. So, yeah, that will come to our conversation. If you don't mind waiting.
I don't mind.
So when I look at in the first chart, grand total all funds, our FY 26 proposed budget is a $500 million budget. On the surface, that seems really big. But there's a couple things that go into that. The number right above it, non-departmental, that is mostly reserves. And there's gonna be a slide that's gonna break that out. Reserves that are saved for future years. The other thing is, we have the Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission. It's an intergovernmental agency created, I want to say back in the 70s, essentially, processing our waste stream for the Eugene Springfield area. And how we split up the management of that agency is that City of Springfield handles the admin and the capital program, and City of Eugene handles the operations. However, the entire budget, because we're the admin piece and then do the legal adoption of the budget, which is part of our legal adoption, the entire MWMC budget passes through our budget. So looking at that, 400, almost $500 million, 190 of that is MWMC. And so that kind of starts to change the scale of how big. So I like to focus on the operating budget, which is 145 million. And that includes, and I'll kind of break out MWMC as we go along. But that's the number I think I would focus on, and I'll mention the capital right above the non-departmental of 130 million. We tend to budget our capital projects in full at the front end of the project, but they can span multiple years. So looking at the operating budget, 145 million. The largest piece of that is personal services, which I mentioned earlier. And then if you come down to the bottom chart, you can see how personal services break out. 60% of that is salaries. The next biggest pieces are PERS at 17.6, and then our medical dental at 12.2. And that's, when I mentioned that medical dental being flat for over a decade, that's a big portion of our budget. So that to be able to contain that cost has really been a blessing. And starting to look at those numbers broken down into a pie chart. Again, we're looking at all requirements. You can see just kind of the scale compared to each other. This gets to the non-departmental, which, I mentioned was 220 million. And in addition to reserves, we also have interfund transfers. That's not money leaving the organization. That's just money being transferred between funds. And honestly, the only slice that's leaving the organization is the debt service, 6% of that 220 million. So the rest of it is locked up for future years. And of that 220 million, 61 million is MWMC. All right, looking at the $145 million operating, largest portion of that is development and public works. That includes 4 major programs. That includes our development counter, our sewer program, our drainage program, and our street program. And then of that 64 million for DPW, 30 million of that is MWMC. And then our capital budget, the 130 million, and this actually breaks it out, and MWMC makes up actually the majority of that at 76%. All right, FY 26 highlights. So this is essentially how we balance the budget. Before I go into that, in fiscal years 21 and 22, it was mostly reductions. And then in fiscal year 23, we had ARPA funds, and we started to make those smart, because we cut deep in 21.2, I think possibly even almost too deep. We started to make smart investments in key areas. And then 24 and 25 were status quo. Again, we had the ARPA funds that were helping just sort of back up the general fund. However, in fiscal year 25, that was the last year of the ARPA funds. So getting back to fiscal year 26, we're back to having to make reductions. There is one exception to that. Councilor Doyle, did you have a question?
I can wait till we get to the question and answer, because I do have a question about.
Yes, no.
So we call it a reduction, but if a department is saying that they have a reduction, but they still have an increase in their budget, how is that a reduction? Like if I'm gonna buy a pair of shoes on Friday with my paycheck and I realize my paycheck, I don't have enough money, I can't say I took a $50 reduction. I didn't buy the shoes, right? It's because they weren't part of the, my regular bills that I pay all the time. So I don't understand how we can call that a reduction.
Okay, that's one way of looking at it. I'm not gonna say that's an incorrect way of looking at it. I think,
It's a reduction of increases. That's not a reduction.
um,
It would be that 25 budget that says you have 145 million. And now you're showing 150 million. You should, the cut should be 145 million that you budgeted the year before, not. To get an idea what you need to cut back on.
so for this evening's conversation, I'm gonna call it a reduction of the increase. Is that
A
all?
reduction of an
'Cause-
increase.
'cause it
Okay,
is.
that's what it is then.
And just grow over time by inflation. And so, and in fact, I'll give you a classic example of that is our merged fire department. I think one of the questions is, they said, how you tell us about all these savings, yet every year you've still grown after you've merged, but we grew by less than we would have if we hadn't merged, if that makes sense. So if we hadn't merged, we might have seen 5 or 6% growth. By functionally merging, we were able to contain that growth to 3%. So, part of our reduction strategy is to help contain that growth and hopefully get that growth in line with our revenue source, which is capped artificially at 3%. So it's language, I hear you, but it doesn't change kind of the larger challenge is that, you probably couldn't find a single business that's budget doesn't grow incrementally over time with inflation. And then you're always just looking for different ways to sort of manage that growth, to contain that growth.
Yeah, but if I have 10 employees and I need to reduce costs. I don't say, well, I was gonna hire an 11th person and I'm not gonna do that. So now I've cut by one FTE.
Well, we've cut we let actual people go. And back to it's a reduction for if you have 200 FTE and then you cut 2 FTE and you're down to 198. Those 198 might be more expensive than the 200 in the prior year because of
Yeah.
just inflation.
But like
So
that,
we're
the
actually-
80,000 for the eliminate library tech, that's a library tech that was retiring, right? So.
No, I'll get into the
Okay, all right.
details of each of these.
Okay.
So we did do an ad though. It's not in the general fund. It's a code compliance officer and it's being paid for out of the building code and stormwater operation fund. And I believe this is a position that Jeff Pascal talked about or Charlie Kent with the code enforcement program. But getting into reductions, and this also, I think, might kind of play into your question, Councilor Doyle, is the very first one is it's a reduction to the general fund, but it's not a reduction to the city's budget. Because in that particular case, we gave reduction targets to all the departments. And one of the ways that Development of Public Works was able to address their reduction target was to reallocate their fund staff, the fund that was paying for that staffing from the general fund to other funds. I think in this particular case, and these were legitimate in terms of they were still aligned with those funds, but moved $200,000 in staffing to the building code fund, the special revenue fund, which is the tech fee, which we just brought in the use of the tech fee, and then to the SDC fund. And that resulted in $200,000 in savings to the.
Yeah,
general
that's actually a question I was gonna ask about the building code fund for public works. That's great. I could cross that question out.
And then in fire, we eliminated the public information officer position. So this was a position that was in the budget. It showed up as part of the budget. They even went through the process of interviews and had a candidate identified. However, at that point in time, conversations around the budget, they realized that they were gonna have to make a cut and they didn't go that final step of making that offer. So we actually didn't have to eliminate a person, but it was a needed position in the fire budget. And then in fire, we asked for a $250,000 reduction. They're gonna make up the other $126,000 through off-peak fire station staffing, which essentially is just kind of looking at the data around calls for service. And if there's certain times of the week or hours of the day where they can reduce staffing levels at a fire station, we hope to generate $126,000 in savings that way. In the library, they had a position where that actually, there was another position at the city that was vacant and this individual from the library had applied and got the position. This position got vacant, so we didn't actually have to cut a person, But there was an individual who did leave the organization and another individual that transferred into that position they left vacant, generating those savings. In police, I'll go to the bottom one first. For their $250,000 target, they eliminated 2 community service officer positions. One of those positions was vacant, the other position had someone in it, and so that's where there was a layoff involved. And then the city retirement plan unfunded liability. So in addition to PERS, we had a legacy retirement plan for our police department. And, we have an actuary who kind of, says, okay, this is the amount that you need to contribute into that. It's got to equal to or better with PERS, and it's got an interest guarantee and, an expensive plan. And so we were making lump sum contributions to that every year. Going back maybe 8 years, the contribution was $1.35 million a year. And, over time, that money's invested, it's, generating returns. That actuary, it was underfunded, the liability was underfunded. The actuary was reducing the amount that we needed to contribute, that we were required to contribute. But I chose to leave it at the 1.35 million with the goal of getting it fully funded as soon as possible. And last year, we got close to that target. And so we reduced it from 1.35 down to 800,000. And then the most recent actuarial evaluation said you only need to contribute $220,000 a year. And so we could reduce it by another $580,000. So that's, money for decades that we were spending out of the police budget that now could, essentially be saved. And I'm pleased to say that that city retirement plan is now, as of this time, fully funded. And I think we're down to 5 members, 2 active employees. So this is a plan that's been around for a long time, and it is going to sunset soon. I'm really looking forward to that. Yes.
Question about the elimination of empty positions in your budget. That creates savings in your budget, but doesn't it also eliminate the opportunity for those end of year fiscal savings
Yes,
related to those positions?
it can, yes.
So the 800,000 that you built in to.
Our fiscal savings, and I talk about this a lot, we're still gonna leave it at 800,000, but what we're finding is, as I mentioned, in fiscal year 24, we had no fiscal savings. We went over 100,000. They're getting tighter and tighter, smaller and smaller. But I'm not ready to lower them yet. Again, I'm okay going over budget. So here's how we really balance the budget. First 2 are forfeiture funds in our special revenue fund for taser replacement, jail access control. But it is one-time funds. And so in our special revenue fund, we have 2 streams of revenue. One was a Comcast settlement that we received years ago. It feels like about a decade ago. It was around $500,000. It's been sitting there sort of as savings for some purpose at some point. And we pulled on it this year. And so we're transferring it from the special revenue fund to the general fund to help plug that deficit spend. Additionally, we have from the opioid settlement that happened some years back, the city's receiving a percentage of that settlement. These are monies that have to be used for drug-related purposes. And the other thing they have on them is they have a timeline to be saved. If they're not spent within 5 years of receipt, you have to give them to the state. No other state has this rule. I don't know why our state decided to do that, but the point is we've got some funds that are approaching that 5-year period. So we to make sure we get those spent, don't give a penny back. We're allocating 250,000 to our funding for Cahoots. We felt that was correlated well. So, but those are one-time funds again. Eventually they'll be gone. And then we accessed our rainy day funds over that I mentioned that we got from the benefit holidays. However, those are contributed by FTE by every fund, and a lot of those funds have spending restrictions. The street fund has a spending restriction. The building code fund has a spending restriction. So, honestly, the sewer and the drainage fund have a restriction. The public doesn't want us using those funds for other purposes other than sewer and drainage. So it's sort of a self-imposed restriction. But to get at, the general funds, FTE contributed roughly 50% of that savings. So to get that money back to the general fund, we have to send $2 million to all the funds, whether or not they need it. Now, the street fund definitely needs it, the ambulance fund definitely needs it. But that kind of gets at that restriction that you spoke to, Bob. And that's essentially how we've balanced our general funds with one-time funds. That is not sustainable. And kind of back to the forecast and to the fiscal stability task force. And I'll speak a little bit to that. The other thing I also want to just touch on, something that's not here that we added in 2020 and 21, and then we discontinued it thereafter, is we were making transfers to a capital fund for deferred maintenance of city facilities. And so if I go all the way back to this forecast, back further than I'm at, there we go. That's just operations. That is, we are not setting any money aside for deferred maintenance. Our backlog of deferred maintenance right now, we estimate to be around $250 to $300 million. We're talking about all of our street infrastructure, all of our traffic signaling infrastructure. We're talking about our city hall facility, our justice center facility, our operations facility. We're talking about our 5 fire stations. That's not touching any of our commercial properties. That's just touching our government facilities for government use. And so, we're just trying to keep our service levels at the same level that they have been at historically without, we think about it, but, would be happy to just plug that deficit, let alone additional dollars to start saving for that deferred maintenance. So, and this isn't unique to the city of Springfield. In fact, we'd argue having, seeing what's going on around us and some of these other communities doing similar types of task force or processes and looking at their deficits and their challenges, we're one of the better run cities amongst our peers. And I think that's something we can be proud of. Future year considerations, I won't talk about all these. I think a lot of these are familiar to all of you. They're up there from year to year. Inflation, it happened, it's real, it's still with us, and there's still questions regarding it going into the future. So it's a big consideration and challenge of ours. Let's see, backlog deferred maintenance, I just talked about that. The ARPA funding sunset that ended in fiscal year 25. And so that was sort of a crutch of sorts for a number of years. And now we've got some big challenges in front of us. And then lastly, the mayor's fiscal stability task force. And this is a good slide, I think, to talk about the fiscal stability task force. And that, these are some of the options we have to address our structural imbalance. And the first two is where we'd like to go. Encourage smart growth, encourage urban infill and density. We recently implemented an HDTE, high density tax exemption. On the surface, I think a lot of folks are like, well, that can provide in certain areas up to 10-year property tax exemption. And if you have challenges, why would you want to do that? But I think what I would say is, I mentioned earlier, I've been here for almost 20 years. Kitty corner from us is a bare lot. Been bare the entire time that I've worked here. When I started here 20 years ago, we had an HDT and someone had built that, real estate development over in that lot. You would have started paying increment 10 years ago. And so that's kind of what I see then is if, we're not seeing that infill happen on its own. So if we can incentivize it some way, but once you've got the increment in place, it's increment for life. Which is powerful if we're thinking long-term, 50 years, 100 years out. So encourage smart growth, grow your economic base. That's another thing we work on. Where we end up going though is typically the next two, diversify your revenue base and service level changes. And lastly, it's just legislative policy changes. One of the challenges we've been having is mandates from the state that have costs associated with them, but no funds to help offset the cost of those mandates. And so, trying to work at the legislative level to say either one, you can't set these mandates down without funding or to find some funding source for those. These were the tools that we provided to the fiscal stability task force. Again, they met for 9 weeks between January 15th and March 12th. Next week, May 19th, the report that's going to capture their work and recommendations will be going in front of council in a work session, if any of you are interested. But what comes out of that task force could potentially have a significant impact on that structural imbalance and city services as we move forward. And we'll be back in budget committee in future years, potentially with some of those impacts, hopefully from the fiscal stability task force. That is it for my presentation. Any questions?
So, question in terms of creative revenue, opportunities. I noticed in a number of the presentations, there were comments about grants that had come in, federal grants and what have you. Could you talk a little bit about how does that work with the city? Does each department go and find those and look for those and apply for those? Or is there more of a city-wide effort to look across those? Because I'm just curious how those are found, applied for, et cetera.
So we're decentralized when it comes to our grant program, and essentially, some large organizations, a lot of times will have individuals that's their entire job is writing grant applications. For us, within each department, we often have management analysts, and it's a position that wears many hats. They could be the person that does their budget. They can be the person that also does their procurement. They would be the person that also would look for and apply for grants. Our police department does a really good job. Jessica Crawford is a business services manager in the police department, and there are a number of grants that she brings into the organization every year. More recently, in courts, which is under finance, our presiding judge applied for and received a grant for a treatment court. Again, that was initiated by the presiding judge coming out of that department. Same thing for all the other departments. It's typically looking for those funds, those opportunities. That being said, we're not heavily dependent on grants, thankfully, because again, there's a lot of uncertainty around them going forward. Typically, we try not to use them for operational purposes, but rather use them for one-time needs. So.
On the building code, it seems like we have around $7 million, is that right?
Yes.
How much would you say then is too much? I'm assuming that the personnel that you have is staffed well enough. So then do you foresee like you have too much because you can only spend it in building? Would you then look to cut revenues for a window?
It's a great question that I can't answer, but we could bring up Jeff Pascal, who I think, you got an answer for that, Jeff?
For what the right size reserve is?
Yes, or what we could do to kind of help ease, I guess, is there fees that we can
save
use,
that
allows or
for
step at the
couple
state.
nights, or just like-
Yeah, Jeff Pascal, Community Development Director. So for the right size reserve, I don't necessarily have a good answer. It kind of depends fund by fund and program by program. One thing I think Nathan did a good job mentioning is the last time we went through a recession, our reserve got really low and we were actually looking at potential layoffs, or what we did negotiate was part-time. And so I think projecting out, looking at where the economy may be going, is we may have a healthy reserve today, but the key is some of those folks are really hard to find and hire building inspectors. And even if we only have a handful of buildings out there, we still need all those various trades. And so the key is to make sure that we have a reserve to maintain for the future. I would say right now, that's why you're looking at we're adding, proposing to add a staff member, because we do have good reserves, and one of those is dealing with code complaints about buildings without permits, stormwater issues that we're having, things like that.
And before the Great Recession, it got as high as, I think, around 4 million, and we drew that all the way down almost to zero. So.
And some of that too, you'll see that's how in CMD community development, we met our general fund target was by looking at our positions and reassessing which positions may be more aligned with building and what they're doing at our front counter and what they're doing in those permit processes, and saying that maybe their job aligns and or they could pick up some of the work, because we are very busy still with a lot of permits. Things have leveled off, but that's one tool we used, so you'll see that reserve probably come down a little.
Is the fire marshal in that fund?
I don't think so. They have their own fees. I think they're a small
We have
amount.
a small amount.
It's a small amount. I'm not certain on what the exact allocation is to that, but they do get a small piece for review plans.
In general, with reserves across your entire budget, do you find that Springfield has high reserves compared to other cities?
Never taken the time to look into that. I can't imagine, when I talk about the general fund again, 25% is pretty standard. And so I think you're gonna see that across most organizations. I think it varies from community to community, but I think Oregon's been experiencing strong growth and development across most communities. So if I was a hazard a guess, I think we probably would see some parallels, but I haven't taken the time to look into it.
So I saw in past budgets, those nodes that were being developed around town as a way to have a mixed use and kind of a residential business, and also a climate positive design. Are we working towards more of that might be multi-family unit focus so that we get more of those possibilities for revenue increases? Is that kind of a model we're continuing to support? And
So we did have nodal development areas that were adopted in the past. So what we have is from the state is looking at climate friendly areas, which is probably what you've heard about going in front of the council. Most of those areas, or at least the two primary, that's what they were originally. And so that is the goal, is to get more, but the goal of the state is to get that lesser carbon footprint by folks being able to live in an area that has all of their services that are walkable. And higher density housing, things like that. So that is a goal. That is something that when Nathan was speaking about the unfunded mandates, that is one of those mandates from the state that our planning staff is working on and bringing information to the council in the future.
so am I correct in understanding that, yes, it was an unfunded mandate, but if a large property isn't supporting its, the services to it, but the mandate is directing us towards that higher density and more condensed development, isn't that an advantage or gets us to meeting more of our revenue goals?
I think I have an answer to that one, which is the state's approach is one size fits all. And I think often it's not that we don't disagree with what their goal is, but we feel that for our community, there could be a better way to accomplish it as opposed to sort of top down, this is the way that you do it. So that's how I would respond.
I think that's dovetails to our response to trying to create those higher densities was working with the council and getting a high density tax exemption for that. We actually received our first one and approved it, so it's working. And I think that was our goal with how Springfield wanted to approach getting those higher density developments.
Okay, thank you.
Kind of a technical accounting question. I noticed in the budget that the difference between resources and expenditures up until FY 25 was shown typically apparently as an ending balance, whereas starting in FY 25 it's shown it's included as a reserve and there's a zero ending balance. Is that an intentional change in accounting, or what would be the difference between an ending balance and a reserve?
So I'm gonna look at Jessica because, so Jessica came on a year ago. And one of the things that I said is make this document yours. She's got a lot of experience with budget documents. She does and has for years reviewed documents for the GFOA for the Budget Presentation Award. And she has been making a lot of changes to that document. Is that one of the changes? Okay. So that's someone who looks at hundreds of documents from hundreds of organizations in her free time. And starting to implement what she likes, documents into more documents. Is that a fair way to?
That is.
So I noticed that, I know that the MWMC does a lot of work to prepare kind of their own budget within things. Can you just give me an explanation of where does the budget committee sit with respect to directing the MWMC's budget? Because I know it's represented on here as, I mean, a lot of the city of Springfield's resources are kind of put together with that. I'm just kind of curious about the utility of that, if you could explain how separate or together that is with respect to the budget committee's oversight on that.
So typically, this budget committee really doesn't have oversight on the MWMC. So they've already gone through their own budget process as a governing body. They've also brought that budget in front of our council, in front of the city of Eugene's council. So as it pertains to the MWMC budget in this process, all we're doing is the final legal requirements in terms of how it's adopted. But essentially is sort of left kind of touched, not touched, as is.
That makes sense. Thank you.
I have one other question. Do you foresee, kind of looking down the road, that Booth Kelly will ever become a revenue generation again? Or is it like gonna keep?
It's still generating revenue. It's just not generating to the extent, I guess, where we felt like we was like, hey, there's a couple $100,000, we could help balance our budget. And I think there's also recognition now that whatever excess revenue that generates above expenditures, it needs to start reinvesting that money into that facility and start to address the.
It needs a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do envision, and I don't think I'm getting ahead of myself, is that there could be a conversation with council in the future, what the future is of that site. You know, we are not developers, and so there's the possibility that a private developer could, convert it into a better, higher use that could potentially generate more increment than it is generating now. The fact that we lease it out commercially, the only government properties that are tax exempt are ones that are used for government purposes. So if we lease it out, it's just kind of on the market commercially, then the county does charge property taxes. So it is generating increment, but it could be developed in a way that I think could produce more at some point in the future. So that'll be a council conversation.
When you were talking about redevelopment earlier, I'm thinking specifically of Booth Kelly and the old Ware Mart on Mohawk as potentially urban development areas. Would those fall under that kind of category of redevelopment, even though it's not generating revenue for this city immediately?
I think so. And, when we talk about the area that you're talking about over at Mohawk, there's also conversations around, we have 2 urban renewal districts. It's a powerful economic development tool. What I like to say with them is when they first start, you kind of plant a seed at the frozen base and it grows very slow and it takes a while before they start to mature and kind of produce. Our 2 urban renewal districts are kind of at that mature phase now where we're starting to see really big things happen. So it might be the time to plant the seed for another one so that as these ones are starting to wind down, that one's starting to step up, and that could potentially be a great area to draw a boundary, for future development. And then that gives us some tools to help incentivize development within that boundary. Yes.
So one of the points I read in one of the presentations was about out at North Gateway, that area that's, I think, been brought into the urban growth boundary, if I got that right. So I'm curious, back to your point of, once you get a owner in a space and they're generating that tax base, in perpetuity, how is that calculated in terms of prioritizing, I guess, building an infrastructure there so you can start to get structures, homes, businesses there, because those first dollars will certainly take some from the budget, but it will have that payback. How is that kind of, I don't know, determined? Because it seems like that's an opportunity there. So I'm just curious, because I know it's been tabled for a period of time. That's what the presentation said.
Yeah, so typically council's the one who, that kind of get into a policy area where they prioritize where they'd like us to invest our energy. I can say one of their, I think, high priority areas right now is the Glenwood area, in terms of that.
I see. So it's kind of mind share,
It's-
bandwidth, energy, just to get that done. Move forward. Okay. Gotcha.
Well, I want to piggyback on that with the Glenwood area. That adds more property to the city's inventory of taxable revenue generate property taxes. So are we seeing that bump at some point in the future budget?
Yeah, we have, and you'll get a presentation on Wednesday evening, for the two urban renewal areas. We've actually seen, probably a larger bump. It started later and, the Glenwood area started in 2004, downtown in 2007. But the downtown has surpassed Glenwood at this time. But we've also got, the process in Glenwood's been very slow, but we're kind of at a pivotal point where I think things will start to pick up. But that'll be part of the Wednesday's presentation.
Okay, so it looks like we are, the final item on tonight's agenda is business for the audience. So has staff received any requests to speak cards?
There have been no requests to speak cards received, and I am looking to see if anybody has their virtual hand raised. I'm gonna give it just about 10 more seconds to see if anybody raises their virtual hand. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No hands are raised.
Perfect. Okay, so then it looks like if there's no other business, I adjourn the Springfield Budget Committee. Our next meeting will be held Tuesday, May 15th.
Bob.